The Spiritualist Tide. Madame Blavatsky explained that she approached America, the land of spiritualism, with feelings not unlike those of Mohammedan, approaching the birthplace of his prophet. The opening created by spiritualism made the young nation into a magnet for every kind of spiritual experiment. And like many cultural openings, this one appeared so quickly and dramatically that it could leave observers unsure of what was even occurring. The Shakers had prophesied that spirits would visit every city and hamlet, every palace and cottage in the land. And that prophecy began coming to pass in March of 1848, directing us once more to the American occult's equivalent of Mount Sinai, the burned-over district of upstate New York. In a small wood-framed house outside Rochester, in a village named Hydesville, lived two attractive young girls, Kate, who had just turned 11, and Margaret, 14. Weird things had been happening in the Fox home. Strange cracklings and noises ripped through the darkened rooms, coming, it seemed, from nowhere. The girls told their Methodist parents that the bangs and knocks were spirit raps. Soon, in front of baffled neighbors, the young sisters made a display of asking questions and receiving replies in the form of ghostly raps, worked out in a language so that knocks corresponded to letters of the alphabet. Local tales told of the murder of a traveling peddler in the area, and sure enough, bones were discovered in the Fox basement. They were considered the earthly remains of the rapping spirit, whom the Fox girls eerily called Mr. Splitfoot. Within weeks, curiosity seekers, clergy, and newspaper reporters converged on the little hamlet. The girls were tested, talked about, and looked over by newspaper editor Horace Greeley, New York Supreme Court Justice John Edmunds, and a variety of religious and scientific examiners, many of whom publicly attested to the genuineness of the phenomena. Americans were transfixed, and by the end of the 1840s, the spiritualist era was born. Why did the relatively modest event grip people so? Hauntings, ghosts, and belief in an afterlife had touched every culture and civilization, and news from the spirit world was hardly unknown in America. The public universal friend had claimed to speak as an avatar from the heavens. The Poughkeepsie seer had already produced his first massive volume of trance writing, and the Shakers had reported that spirits were visiting them 10 years prior to Rochester. So spirit communiques were nothing new. But the story told by the Fox sisters provided something of a different order. It fulfilled what was implicit in the career of Andrew Jackson Davis, that spirit communication was open to anyone, anytime. If two teenage girls could reach the other world, it stood to reason that everyone could. It was a completely egalitarian take on the supernatural, with newspapers and publicity-hungry investigators ready to spread the word. And the spirit raps heard in Rochester could strike at the deepest emotions of American homes in an era when children were constantly lost to disease. In New York City in 1853, nearly half of all reported deaths were children under 5. "And oh, mother that reads this," wrote Harriet Beecher Stowe in Uncle Tom's Cabin, "has there never been in your house a drawer or a closet, the opening of which has been to you like the opening again of a little grave? Ah, happy mother that you are, if it has not been so." For many, the hope of contact soothed the agony of loss. As the news from Rochester spread, grieving parents, widows and widowers, or those simply pursuing otherworldly thrills, gathered together in clubs and parlor rooms, schoolhouses and churches, to reach out to the dead. And many avowed that such contact came. In darkened rooms, tables lifted and rocked, Disembodied knocks cracked through the night air, and trance mediums spoke in otherworldly voices. "I am here, mother," a medium might intone, as a listener sobbed and squeezed the hands of those on either side of her. Americans like organizing things, and the supernatural was no exception. Within a decade of the Fox sisters, the nation saw the growth of spiritualist clubs, lecture societies, and seance circles. Modeled on the instructions developed by Andrew Jackson Davis in his 1851 book, The Philosophy of Spiritual Intercourse, 300 distinct circles emerged in Philadelphia alone during that decade. According to a survey, the burned-over district was home to 89 trance mediums and spiritualist lecturers by 1859. And those numbers probably failed to capture the full range of hobbyist mediums. In 1850, journalist E.W. Capron counted in Auburn, New York, 50 to 100 mediums in different stages of development, including those who could induce unseen hands to strum guitars and pound drums. In the 1850s and beyond, believers and enthusiasts were served by dozens of newspapers specifically devoted to spiritualist phenomena and ideas. Among the largest were the Banner of Light and the New Era in Boston, the Spiritual Telegraph in New York, the Better Way in Cincinnati, the Carrier Dove in Oakland, and Spiritual Republic and Religio-Philosophical Journal in Chicago. Most were ardently progressive, espousing suffragism and abolitionism alongside news of the spirit world. The Religio-Philosophical Journal, which began publication just after the Civil War, launched its maiden issue with an editorial against capital punishment for Confederate leaders, urging spiritualists to heal the breach of war and begin the regenerative work of enlightening and spiritualizing the masses. There soon emerged spiritualist churches, summer camps, and, again at the instigation of Andrew Jackson Davis, Sunday schools, the first of which opened in New York in 1863. It was based on Davis's description of teaching methods in the heavenly realm of Summerland, aiming to cultivate the wisdom of the imperishable and perfect soul of the individual child. Davis's children's lyceums anticipated future trends in progressive education by emphasizing the personal needs of each pupil. In the minds of many spiritualists, their movement held a special place for children. Oakland's Carrier Dove featured a children's department, which offered stories of little angels coming to converse with Wee Willie and Maud. In 1886, the paper covered a children's séance, where a motherly trance medium placed the little stand into the center of the room and took her seat beside it. Then called the children 6 at a time to come and put their hands upon it, while it danced to the tune of lively music. Then came the raps, and each child received some little message. It was indeed a beautiful picture to see the sweet, animated faces of the little ones as they heard for the first time the signals from the spirit land. Mysterious numbers. While the numbers were large, it is difficult to say precisely how many Americans considered themselves spiritualists in the 19th century. The figure of 1.5 million out of a total population of about 30 million appears repeatedly at the movement's initial flush of excitement in the 1850s, sometimes attributed to the surveys, other times not attributed at all. Works of history, both old and new, report figures upward of that amount. As a rule, the higher the number, the thinner the attribution. 2.5 million from the pen of a sympathetic Reverend W.R. Hayden in 1885, and repeated in an influential British study. 3 million reported in several early spiritualist journals, 9 million claimed in 1874 by the movement's preeminent theologian, Davis, confirmed while in a clairvoyant trance, and Boston's Banner of Light, hitting the all-time record, reported 11 to 13 million the same year. It was, claimed the Banner, a figure encompassing the many secret believers who were afraid to formally step forward. Given spiritualism's nationwide range of clubs and publications, including a peak of 67 newspapers, it is reasonable to estimate that the population ran into hundreds of thousands and, depending on how stringently one defines a follower, possibly 1 million or higher. In a nation that counted its overall population at 30 to 35 million in the mid-19th century, it is likely that almost 1 in 10 free adults considered themselves believers of one degree or another. The numbers were so large that by the close of the 1850s, the burned-over district had become eclipsed by the movement it spawned and would no longer serve as the laboratory of mystical religion in American life. Chicago, Boston, New York, Philadelphia, and many towns and cities had spiritualist societies, newspapers, and congregations, and soon produced innovations of their own. Spiritualism was not a regional sensation, but a national movement. He was too good for this earth. When facing the tragedies of death, many families were remarkably alike. In this sense, the spiritualist experience was typified by the household of the most famous family in the nation, the Lincolns. Several months after occupying the White House in March of 1861, Abraham and Mary Todd Lincoln experienced the nightmare of so many mid-century parents. Their 11-year-old son, Willie, was gripped by a serious fever, probably from typhus. A sensitive, precociously religious child with a keen mind and a love for adult company, Willie was the family favorite. He was seen holding hands with his father, whom he sometimes accompanied on official trips, the two sharing a room together. After illness struck, weeks of struggle and bedside vigils did no good. In February of 1862, the boy died late one afternoon. "My poor boy," Lincoln said at the bedside. "He was too good for this earth. God has called him home. I know that he is much better off in heaven, but then we loved him so. It is hard to have him die." For Mary Todd, the loss was too great. She began to frequent trance mediums in desperate hope of contact. And in the aggrieved mother's heart, contact did occur. One evening, she rushed into the room of her half-sister, who had served as a nursemaid to Willie. "He lives, Emily," the First Lady exclaimed. "He comes to me every night and stands at the foot of my bed, with the same sweet, adorable smile he always had." Mary Todd's was the kind of story told time and again, repeated in newspapers and letters by people from every walk of life, who eloquently, if agonizingly, testified to the reality of another world. For those Americans who ardently believed, spiritualism provided some of the most moving and deeply affecting experiences of their lives. Mary Todd Lincoln, spiritualist. For Mary Todd Lincoln, spiritualism was a lifelong interest, and sometimes a public embarrassment. 7 years after her husband's assassination, she was the subject of bruising articles in February 1872, in both the Boston Herald and the New York Times. Each reported that the veiled widow clandestinely sought out the mediumistic services of the older Fox sister, Margaret. The New York Times, in "A Curious Story About Mrs. Lincoln Reiterated," obliquely called Margaret Fox a well-known lady medium on Washington Street, in Boston. Knowledgeable readers immediately understood the reference to the spiritualist pioneer. Margaret was a no longer young woman, suffering family fissures and heated charges, and countercharges of fraud, and now earning her living at the seance table. Mrs. Lincoln had made the insufficient effort of disguising herself on a Boston hotel registry as a Mrs. Linder. The most famous widow in America joined others at a public sitting in Margaret's parlor, where, reported the Times, the spirit of her lamented husband appeared and, by unmistakable manifestations, revealed to all present the identity of Mrs. Lincoln, which she had attempted to keep secret. In 1875, Mary Todd's one surviving son, Robert, had her briefly committed to a sanatorium, claiming, spuriously, that she was squandering her estate on spiritualist hoo-ha such as that in Boston. And this, at last, is the image with which most historians are comfortable. The widow Lincoln, famously nervous and often depressed, her mind loosened from too much loss, seeking final solace in the darkened seance room. But less understood is that President Lincoln himself may have taken more than a passing interest in spiritualism. In April of 1863, in the presence of a reporter from the Boston Gazette, Lincoln hosted a seance in the Crimson Room of the White House. Attending were Mary Todd, 2 cabinet secretaries, and a trance medium, Charles E. Schockle, who seemed more nervous than anyone else during the whole affair. Twice during the evening he fainted and had to be revived. Once everyone was seated at the table, according to the Gazette's correspondent, Prior Melton, Lincoln gamely pitched political questions to Schockle, the spirit visitors who spoke through him, and the 2 cabinet members, while Mary Todd looked on silently. As with all such episodes in spiritualist history, this one raises the question of which sources to believe. Historian John B. Boucher noted that no trance medium named Charles E. Schockle appeared in any of the spiritualist newspapers of the day, which suggests the Gazette's correspondent may have invented the whole affair. Several days after the Gazette article's publication, however, the New York Herald reprinted the evening's account, which we presume to be true, stated an adjunct note, and added its own news analysis about spiritualism's popularity. Several other newspapers followed suit in reprinting the piece. There is no record of the White House ever disputing the report. Lincoln biographer Carl Sandburg took note of the affair and wondered why the president permitted a reporter to be present at all. The likelihood is that the White House seance served a shrewd political end. Lincoln used the encounter to show the public that, even in the midst of the Civil War, the commander-in-chief could sit back and sample the same kind of parlor-room novelty that other Americans were marveling over. The Gazette story presented Lincoln as relaxed, good-humored, and not excessively encumbered by wartime command. In something of a White House propaganda coup, at least one paper of the Confederacy, Georgia's Macon Daily Telegraph and Confederate, reprinted the Gazette piece in full. Whether elements of the story were fabricated, such as the mysterious, possibly pseudonymous Mr. Schockle, the dialogue does suggest vintage Lincoln. When the medium told the president that an Indian spirit wished to convey a message, Lincoln replied, "Well, sir, I should be happy to hear what His Indian Majesty has to say. We have recently had a visitation from our red brethren, and it was the only delegation, black, white, or blue, which did not volunteer some advice about the conduct of the war." In other settings, the president had often and humorously complained of how visitors liked nothing better than to bestow advice about the war, when what he needed were victories. When Schockle's spirits did get around to giving their inevitable military advice, through the channeled words of no less than Henry Knox, Secretary of War to George Washington, Lincoln was unimpressed. "Well, opinions differ among the saints as well as among the sinners. They don't seem to understand running the machine among the celestials much better than we do." Their talk and advice sounds very much like the talk of my cabinet." Lincoln then asked his discomforted cabinet secretaries whether they agreed that the spirits knew little better how to proceed than the mortals, which elicited stammering assurances from Navy Secretary Gideon Welles that, well, sir, he would certainly consider the matter. Supernatural politics. If the Gazette had intended to expose Lincoln as a spiritualist, it more fully captured him as a good-humored skeptic. But there exists another remembrance of the Civil War era that depicts a different Lincoln from the one teasingly subjecting his cabinet members to spirit councils. An 1891 memoir by a trance medium named Nettie Colburn Maynard, "Was Abraham Lincoln a Spiritualist?" stands apart from some of the era's hackneyed literature in its vividness of style and even verisimilitude. At the end of 1862, wrote Maynard, as the Civil War passed into a second Christmas season, with hopes for peace at a dreary low, she was, at the instigation of Mary Todd Lincoln, ushered into the private quarters of the White House and asked to give a spirit reading to the exhausted commander. At the time, Lincoln had drafted, but not yet signed, the cornerstone measure of his presidency, the Emancipation Proclamation. There was enormous tension in the nation over when or whether he would put his signature to it. "For more than an hour I was made to talk to him," Maynard reported. During the course of her unconscious transmission from the spirit realm, Maynard wrote, Lincoln was assured that if he acted to sign and enforce the Emancipation Proclamation, it would be the primary achievement for which he would be remembered. As Maynard emerged from her trance, she found that a grave hush had fallen over the room. "Mr. President?" asked Congressman Daniel E. Soames of Maine, an onlooker at the séance. "Would it be improper for me to inquire whether there has been any pressure brought to bear upon you to defer the enforcement of the proclamation?" "Yes," Maynard reported Lincoln saying. "It is taking all of my nerve and strength to withstand such a pressure." Lincoln then turned to the teenage medium. "My child, you possess a very singular gift, but that it is of God I have no doubt. I thank you for coming here tonight. It is more important than perhaps anyone present can understand." Whether any part of the account is true cannot be known, but it underscores a distinct and misunderstood quality among many American spiritualists. And this was the desire to associate supernaturalism with the social good. Maynard's account, and particularly her record of Lincoln's remarks, also shows spiritualism's continued emphasis on Christian underpinnings of mediumship. Here is the impulse of Andrew Jackson Davis and his vision of heaven as a place containing all of the world's peoples. Of the Shakers, to whom spirits spoke of the need to end slavery and the tragedy that settlers had visited upon the Indians, and of the Freemasons and their ideal of a religious nation that eschewed sectarian division. Maynard, whatever her veracity as a witness, sought not to convince the public that she counseled Lincoln on how to conduct himself in war, how to exercise power, or how to deal with the Confederacy, but rather that, through her trance reading, she advised him to do the greatest thing a leader could do in the eyes of social reformers. In this way, spiritualism was both an occult movement and a political one. It attracted the interest and participation of utopians, suffragists, and radicals because, among other things, it provided a setting in which women, for the first time in American history, could regularly serve as religious leaders, at least of a sort. Most spirit mediums were women, with many voting rights activists among them. Spiritualist thought leaders included the formidable Anglo-American religious thinker Emma Harding Britton, an early theosophist and political reformer who had stumped for Lincoln's candidacy, and who saw spiritualism as the basis of a new religious order. Andrew Jackson Davis's second wife, the seer married thrice, was the suffragette activist Mary Fenn Love, who, in 1853, co-convened the first New York State Women's Rights Convention. "Spiritualism has inaugurated the era of women," Love announced. In 1872, the Equal Rights Party, a consortium of suffragists and abolitionists, named trans medium Victoria Woodhull the nation's first female presidential candidate. Woodhull had gained national prominence the previous year in a historic voting rights speech before the Congressional Judiciary Committee. She was the first woman to appear before a joint committee of Congress. She later told supporters that the Woodhull Memorial, as her testimony was known, had been dictated to her in a dream by a ghostly, tunic-wearing Greek elder, a spirit guardian who had guided all of her public utterances ever since she was a little girl. Woodhull's presidential campaign was quixotic and short-lived, quickly eclipsed by her twin passions for publicity-mongering and political chicanery. The medium activist selected Frederick Douglass as her running mate, but without asking him. "I never heard of this," the abolitionist hero later said. Another spiritualist voice in Congress belonged to U.S. Senator James Shields. In 1854, the Illinois Democrat rose on the Senate floor to present a petition signed by 15,000 American spiritualists. Shields begged senators to take seriously the petitioner's request to fund a scientific commission to investigate the possibility of talking to the dead. Perhaps, Shields offered, even looking into establishing a spiritual telegraph between the material and spiritual world. For most spiritualists, science and religion were not at odds, but were natural allies in the march of progress. Many considered communiques from the spirit world to be as scientifically provable as the electrical current or the telegraph signal, faculties that only strengthened their belief in unseen forms of communication. Shields's Senate colleagues were having none of it, and in short order they hooted down the former general, one guffawing that his proposal should be dispatched to the Committee on Foreign Relations. Some of the nation's better-respected political reformers also counted themselves as believers in the Rochester rappings. They included the liberal congressman and Lincoln confidant Robert Dale Owen, who participated in dozens of nightly sittings that summoned up a voluptuous female spirit named Katie King. King materialized in physical form and received gifts and doting gazes from the aging activist. When Owen learned he was being tricked by an actress, it so broke him that he spent time in a sanatorium. The reformist newspaper editor Horace Greeley invited the younger Fox sister, Kate, to live for 4 months in his dark, rambling home in Chappaqua, New York. With Greeley and his wife, Kate attempted to contact the couple's departed 5-year-old son. So heavily did the lines between progressive politics and spiritualism intersect in the 19th century that it was rare to find a leader in one field who had not at least a passing involvement in the other. Spirit journeys. Spirit rappings had a peculiar way of spreading. Soon they were being heard at séance circles in the drawing rooms of Paris and London, where the fashionable classes took a deep interest in things that went bump. Spiritualism became, in effect, the first spiritual movement that America exported abroad. In France in the late 1850s, a stout, bearded writer and lecturer named Allan Kardec crafted Spiritism into a full-blown religion, complete with its own cosmic theology, liturgy, and doctrine of redemptive or karmic reincarnation. Determined to appear as no one's imitator, Kardec displayed little fondness for his American counterparts, or it seemed for anyone. His English friend and translator Anna Blackwell recalled Kardec as possessing such a habitual sobriety of demeanor that he was never known to laugh. Regardless, after his death in 1869, the French theologian became venerated as a kind of spiritualist saint in Latin America, where his writings had been spread by Portuguese traders. To the current day, Kardec's image, depicted not as stout, but firm and angular, appears on devotional candles and amulets from Peru to the barrios of North America. In Brazil, where Espiritismo is an officially recognized faith, the government placed Kardec's image on a postage stamp in 1957 to celebrate the first centenary of organized Spiritism. And spiritualism traveled still farther, inspiring a vast supernatural religion in the nation of Vietnam. It began in the late 1920s, when a Vietnamese civil servant working for the French colonial administration conceived of the faith he called Cadaism, roughly religion of the high palace. It was a melange of Eastern traditions, from Taoism to Buddhism to Hinduism, combined with the ideas of Allan Kardec and other French spiritists, including poet and novelist Victor Hugo, himself a habitué of séances. To communicate with the other world, Cadaism relied upon American spiritualism's most popular innovation, the Ouija board. Ouija proved surprisingly adaptable to the Latinized version of the Vietnamese language that had begun under the influence of Catholic missionaries. So closely was Ouija associated with Cadaism that novelist Graham Greene in The Quiet America lampooned the Vietnamese faith as prophecy by planchette, using the French name for the little platform that slides around the board. Cadaism had a defiant politics. It was militantly anti-communist and maintained a private army that sided with American forces against the Viet Cong as late as 1975. After the war, the religion fled underground. Newly emergent in the 21st century, Cadaism claims up to 8 million followers worldwide and ranks as Vietnam's third largest faith, after Buddhism and Catholicism. Though unknown to most Americans, whose primary association with Vietnam is war and loss, Cadaism is by far the largest organized religion to emerge from the spiritualist age, and its origins can be traced back to the ghostly rappings heard one winter night at a cottage in the burned-over district. The cradle of modern spiritualism, as Madame Blavatsky once called America, had sent its children on a long journey, and they would find still stranger games to play along the way. Chapter 3. Don't try this at home. Ouija and the selling of spiritualism. These creepy things, there may be great truths in them, but they have nearly destroyed us. Swami Vivekananda, Complete Works. More than a century after the dawn of the spiritualist era, 3 teenage girls, who'd probably never heard the word spiritualism uttered in their 1960s suburban homes, huddled over an object nearly every teenager recognized, the Ouija board. Giggling nervously, they asked about their futures. Will we all get married? They rested their fingers with no more than the weight of a whisker on the molded plastic pointer, or planchette, waiting for the little tripod to slide across the board's lettered surface. And it did, first in a slight jerk and then smoothly, as though guided by some unseen force. As the board's eerie faces of the sun and moon grinned back at the girls, the pointer slid over the word, yes. Will there be divorce? They asked. The pointer moved again. Yes. 3. It was not until years later that the anxious girls, grown into middle-aged women, could look back and laugh. All had married, but only one had divorced. Thrice. By the time youth culture had become big business, when the Beach Boys sang about T-birds and having fun, fun, fun at hamburger stands, developments that would have been as unrecognizable to the Fox sisters as life on Mars, Ouija reigned supreme as the nation's most intriguing novelty. The game board's mysterious movements and beguiling communications made it a staple of slumber parties and toy-cluttered basements. By the late 1960s, its sales rivaled those of the best-selling board game in the world, Monopoly. Though patented and sold as entertainment, Ouija was no ordinary fad. It was, in fact, a homemade device concocted by 19th-century American spiritualists who, from the earliest days of their movement, yearned to make talking with the dead as natural as dinner-time conversation. Whether the object of fear or fascination, Ouija proved the most enduring symbol of their success. Spiritual telegraphs. Among 19th century believers, spiritualism was a practice of deep intimacy. Acolytes squeezed hands around seance tables, felt the quickened breath of those on either side of them, and heard raps and voices in a way that could make the dead seem close enough to embrace. Profoundly touched by their experiences, spiritualists determined to find ever better and easier ways to communicate with the beyond. Acting from the best American instincts, they demanded a do-it-yourself approach to the matter. Their homespun efforts at reaching the afterlife led to what is called Ouija, or what its earliest users called talking boards or spirit boards. But such devices did not appear until early spiritualists and inventors worked through several other methods. One involved a form of table rapping in which questioners solicited spirit knocks when letters of the alphabet were called out, thus spelling a word. Many spiritualists in the 1850s, however, found this a tedious and time-consuming exercise. A faster means was automatic writing, in which spirit beings could communicate through a pen of a medium. But some complained that this produced many pages of unclear or meandering prose. Another invention directly prefigured the heart-shaped pointer that moves around the Ouija board. The planchette, French for little plank, was a three-legged writing tool with a hole at the top for the insertion of a pencil. The planchette was designed for one or more people to rest their fingers upon and allow it to glide across a page to write out a spirit message. The device originated in Europe in the early 1850s. By 1860, commercially manufactured planchettes were advertised in America. Two other items from the 1850s are direct forebears to Ouija: dial plates and alphabet pasteboards. In 1853, a Connecticut spiritualist invented the spiritual telegraph dial, a roulette-like wheel with letters and numerals around its circumference. Dial plates came in various forms, sometimes of a complex variety. Some were rigged to tables to respond to spirit tilts, while others, like planchettes, glided beneath the resting hands of questioners. Alphabet boards further simplified matters. In use as early as 1852, these talking board precursors allowed seekers to point to a letter as a means of prompting a spirit rap, thereby quickly spelling a word. It was perhaps the easiest method yet. And it was only a matter of time until experimenters and entrepreneurs began to see the possibilities. Baltimore oracles. The conventional history of American toy manufacturing credits Ouija to a Baltimore businessman named William Fuld. Fuld, we are told, invented Ouija in around 1890. So it has been repeated in articles, books of trivia, reference works, and Ask Me columns in newspapers. For many decades, the manufacturer itself, first Fuld's company and later the toy giant Parker Brothers, insinuated as much by running the term William Fuld talking board set across the top of every board. The conventional history is wrong. The patent for a Ouija, or Egyptian luck board, was filed on May 28, 1890, by Baltimore resident and patent attorney Elijah J. Bond, who assigned the rights to two city businessmen, Charles W. Kennard and William H. A. Maupin. The patent was granted on February 10, 1891, and so was born the Ouija brand talking board. The first patent reveals a familiarly oblong board, with the alphabet running in double rows across the top and numbers in a single row along the bottom. The sun and moon, labeled respectively yes and no, adorn the upper left and right corners, while the phrase goodbye appears at the bottom center. Later on, instructions and the illustrations accompanying them prescribed an expressly social, even flirtatious experience. Two parties, preferably a man and woman, were to balance the board between them on their knees, placing their fingers lightly upon the planchette. It draws the two people using it into close companionship and weaves about them a feeling of mysterious isolation, the box read. In an age of buttoned-up morals, a toe-to-toe Ouija session could be a tempting dalliance. True origins. The Kennard Novelty Company of Baltimore employed a teenage varnisher who helped run shop operations, and this was William Fuld. By 1892, however, Charles W. Kennard's partners removed Kennard from the company amid financial disputes, and a separate patent, this time for an improved planchette, was filed by a 19-year-old Fuld. In years to come, it was Fuld who would take over the novelty firm and affix his name to every board. After Fuld took the reins of Ouija manufacturing in America, business was brisk, if not always happy. Fuld formed a volatile business alliance with his brother Isaac, which landed the two in court battles for nearly 20 years. Isaac was eventually found to have violated an injunction against creating a competing board called the Oriole, after being forced from the family business in 1901. The two brothers would never speak again. Ouija and anything that looked directly like it was firmly in the hands of William Fuld. So went the business history of Ouija. But the board had a still deeper set of roots. Contrary to the many conflicting claims of ownership, talking boards of a homemade variety were already a popular craze among spiritualists by the mid-1880s. And here we encounter Ouija's lost link to the spiritualist movement. In its Sunday supplement of March 28, 1886, the New York Daily Tribune ran an article on a mysterious talking board and table over which northern Ohio is agitated. The short piece featured a matchbox-size illustration of a rectangular alphabet board, the spitting image of Ouija, a full 4 years before its first patent was filed. I know of whole communities that are wild over the talking board, as some of them called it, an Ohio man was quoted. I have never heard any name for it, but I have seen and heard some of the most remarkable things about its operation, things that seem to pass all human comprehension or explanation. And best of all, anyone can make the whole apparatus in 15 minutes with a jackknife and a marking brush. The 1886 eyewitness described how to use the witching thing as clearly as later instructions on a Ouija box top. You take the board in your lap, another person sitting down with you. You each grasp the little table with the thumb and forefinger at each corner next to you. Then the question is asked. Pretty soon you think the other person is pushing the table. He thinks you are doing the same, but the table moves around to yes or no. Covering the spate of Ouija patent litigation, the New York World asked in 1920, who shall own the cable line to the spirit land? Well, if trial judges had been clearer on the history of the matter, it is possible that the question of who owned Ouija might have been tossed out of court, and the original patent with it. Obviously, Bond, Kennard, and their associates were capitalizing on a spiritualist sensation, not inventing one. Ancient Ouija? Another oft-repeated but misleading claim is that Ouija, or talking boards, have ancient lineage. In a typical example, Frank Gaynor's 1953 Dictionary of Mysticism states that primeval boards of different shapes and sizes were used in the 6th century before Christ. In a wide range of books and articles, everyone from Pythagoras to the Mongols to the ancient Egyptians are said to have possessed Ouija-like devices, but these claims rarely withstand scrutiny. Ouija collector and chronicler Eugene Orlando points out that the primary reference placing Ouija in the pre-modern world appears in Lewis Spence's widely reprinted 1920 Encyclopedia of Occultism. As an invention, it is very old. It was in use in the days of Pythagoras, about 540 BC. According to a French historical account of the philosopher's life, his sect held frequent seances or circles at which a mystic table, moving on wheels, moved towards signs, which the philosopher and his pupil, Philolaus, interpreted to the audience as being revelations, supposedly from the unseen world. It is, Orlando notes, the one recurring quote found in almost every academic article on the Ouija board. But the story presents two problems. The French historical account is never identified, and the Pythagorean scribe Philolaus lived not in Pythagoras' time, but in the following century. While successive generations of Pythagoreans produced a wide range of mathematical and mystical treatises, precious little is known today about the philosopher and his original school. No writings of Pythagoras survive, and the historical record depends upon interpretive works, some of which were written centuries after his death at the end of the 6th century BC. Hence, commentators on occult topics are sometimes tempted to project backward onto Pythagoras all sorts of arcane practices, Ouija and modern numerology among them. Still, other writers, when not repeating claims like the one above, tend to misread ancient historical accounts and mistake other divinatory tools, such as pendulum dishes, for Ouija boards. Oracle methods were rich and varied from culture to culture, from Germanic runes to Chinese pictograms to African cowrie shells. But prevailing literature on oracular traditions supports no suggestion that talking boards were in use before the American spiritualist era. And what, finally, of the beguiling name Ouija? Alternately pronounced Ouija and Ouija, its origin raises another question mark. Baltimore's Charles W. Kennard at one time claimed it was Egyptian for good luck. It's not. William Fuld later said it was simply a marriage of the French and German words for yes. One early investor claimed the board had spelled out its own name. As with other aspects of Ouija history, the board seems determined to withhold a few secrets of its own. Ouija boom. By 1920, the Ouija board was so well known that artist Norman Rockwell painted a send-up of a couple using one, the woman dreamy and credulous, the man fixing her with a cloying grin, for a cover of the Saturday Evening Post. For manufacturer Fuld, though, everything was strictly business. "Believe in the Ouija board?" he told a reporter. "I should say not. I'm no spiritualist. I'm a Presbyterian, been one ever since I was so high." In 1920, the Baltimore Sun reported that Fuld, by his own conservative estimate, had pocketed an incredible $1 million from sales. Whatever satisfaction Fuld's success may have brought him was soon lost. On February 24, 1927, he fell to his death from the roof of his Baltimore factory. The 56-year-old manufacturer had been supervising the replacement of a flagpole when an iron support bar gave way, and he fell 3 stories backward. Fuld's children took over his business, and they generally prospered. While sales dipped and rose, and competing boards came and went, only the Ouija brand endured. And by the 1940s, Ouija was experiencing a new run of sales. Historically, seances and other spiritualist methods have proliferated during times of war, when families struggle with uncertainty and loss. "People have had to bear so many things they had not thought possible," wrote Thomas Mann on an upsurge of spiritualism after World War I, "and to undergo such dramatic events that the indignation we are all still struggling to feel is combined in a not negligible proportion with a tendency to make concessions." During World War II, many American families made concessions to unseen powers and looked toward Ouija for news of loved ones or to reach those who had died. In a 1944 article, "The Ouija Comes Back," the New York Times reported that one New York City department store alone had sold 50,000 Ouija boards in a 5-month period. For all its commercial reach, Ouija remained essentially a family-operated business. But after the war, novelty manufacturing shed its slightly disreputable carnival-style reputation and became a more mainstream line of business. And American toy giants began looking more closely at the enduring curio. In a move that would place an instrument from the age of spiritualism into playrooms all across America, the manufacturer Parker Brothers bought the rights to Ouija for an undisclosed sum in 1966. With the Fuld family out of the picture, Ouija was poised for its biggest success ever. The following year, Parker Brothers is reported to have sold more than 2 million Ouija boards, topping sales of its most popular game, Monopoly. An occult vogue that rode the countercultural tides of the late 1960s as astrologers adorned the cover of Time magazine and witchcraft became a fast-growing new religion, fueled the board's sales for the following decades. A Parker Brothers spokesperson reports the company has sold more than 10 million boards since 1967. The 60s and 70s saw Ouija's reinvention as a fad among adolescents. For some, it was a mere diversion, while for others, its secret messages and intimate communiques became a youthful rite of rebellion. Ouija circles sprang up in college dormitories, often with young women at their helm, unconsciously reprising the role of spirit medium that women had held in the spiritualist days. A one-time teenage experimenter recalled an enticing atmosphere of danger and intrigue, like shoplifting or taking drugs, that allowed her and a girlfriend to bond together over Ouija sessions in which they reached the spirit of Candelin, a 19th-century girl who had perished in a fire. Sociologists suggested that Ouija sessions were a way for young people to project and work through their own fears. But many Ouija users claimed that the verisimilitude of the communications was reason enough to gather around the board. Not all sessions were titillating or adventurous, however. As will be seen, some were tragically, terribly frightening. Ouija in winter. While officials at Parker Brothers, today a division of Hasbro, do not disclose the ebb and flow of sales, there's little question that Ouija declined commercially as it neared the 21st century. In 1999, the company brought a tradition to an end when it discontinued the vintage Fuld-era design and switched to a smaller glow-in-the-dark version of the board. In consumer manufacturing, the redesign of a classic product often indicates an effort to reinvigorate shaky sales. In the first decade of the 21st century, Ouija retailed at $22.99, about 60% more than old favorites like Monopoly and Scrabble, further suggesting its transformation into a specialty item. Today, the Ouija game, ages 8 to adult, merits barely a mention on Hasbro's website. The company posts no official history for Ouija, as it does for its other storied brands, such as Twister and Yahtzee. And the claims from the original 1960s-era box, weird and mysterious, surpasses in its unique results, mind-reading, clairvoyance, and second sight, are now significantly toned down. Given the negative attention the board sometimes attracts, both from frightened users and religionists who smell a whiff of Satan's doings, as well as the fact that its sales are likely on the wane, Ouija seems like a product that Hasbro would just as soon forget. And yet Ouija has a way of hanging on. It receives more customer reviews, alternately written in tones of outrage, fear, delight, or ridicule, than most other toys for sale on Amazon.com. Danger, you can be possessed. I wouldn't even consider using it without deep and sincere prayers for protection. This is a toy made by Parker Brothers, not a satanic board game. Even in its September years, Ouija polarizes opinion among those who dismiss it as a childhood plaything and others who condemn or extol it as a portal to the other side. Just as it figured in The Exorcist in the 1970s, Ouija saw new life in the early 21st century fright films What Lies Beneath and White Noise. A Ouija-based movie entered the early stages of production in 2008, and its urban mythology remains a ubiquitous presence online. There seems little doubt that Ouija, as it has arisen time and again, awaits a revival in the future. But what has made this game board and its molded plastic pointer so resilient in our culture, and, some might add, in our nightmares? An occult splendor. One of the most notable characteristics of Ouija lore is the vast and sometimes authentically frightening history of stories reported by users. A common storyline involves communication that is at first reassuring and even useful. A lost object may be recovered through the board's counsel, but eventually gives way to threatening or terrorizing messages. One group of Ouija enthusiasts reported ghostly knocks on their apartment doors after contacting the spirit of a serial killer. Others claimed physical and sexual assaults from unseen hands after a night of Ouija experimentation. One famous murder trial in 1933 involved claims that Ouija had commanded an Arizona girl and her mother to kill the girl's father. Hugh Lynn Casey, the soft-spoken son of the famous American psychic Edgar Casey, once cautioned that his researches found Ouija boards among the most dangerous doorways to the unconscious. For their part, Ouija enthusiasts respond that influential spiritual teachings such as the Seth material, channeled by writer Jane Roberts in the 1970s, first emerged through the board. In the World War I era, a St. Louis housewife used Ouija to record a remarkable range of novels, plays, and poems from a 17th-century English spinster named Patience Worth. Some were hugely ambitious in scale and written in a Middle English dialect that the St. Louis homemaker, who didn't finish high school, would have had no obvious means of knowing. Ouija writing also produced a posthumous full-scale novel by Mark Twain in 1917, pulled from store shelves after a legal outcry from the writer's estate. While such works won brief popularity, they failed to retain enduring readership. Further up the literary scale, poets Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes wrote haunting and dark passages about their experiences with Ouija. Fame will come, the board tells Sylvia in Ted's 1957 poem, Ouija, and when it comes you will have paid for it with your happiness, your husband, and your life. Though darkly prophetic, such works are not generally counted among either poet's finest efforts. Given that this mysterious object has, in one form or another, been on the American scene for over 120 years, it's natural to wonder, Can anything of lasting value be attributed to Ouija? The answer is yes, and it has stared us in the face for so long that we have nearly forgotten it is there. In 1976, the American poet James Merrill published and won the Pulitzer Prize for an epic poem that recounted his experience with his partner, David Jackson, of using a Ouija board from 1955 to 1974. His work, The Book of Ephraim, was later combined with two other Ouija-inspired epic poems and published in 1982 as The Changing Light at Sandover. Many readers, critic Judith Moffat wrote in her penetrating study, James Merrill, may well feel they have been waiting for this trilogy all their lives. First employing a manufactured board and then a homemade one, with a teacup in place of a planchette, Merrill and Jackson encountered a world of spirit patrons who described for them a sprawling and profoundly involving creation myth. In Merrill's hands it became poetry steeped in the epic tradition, in which myriad characters from W.H. Auden, to lost friends and family members, to a ghostly Greek muse/interlocutor called Ephraim, walk on and off stage. The voices of Merrill, Jackson, and those who emerge from the teacup and board alternately offer theories of reincarnation, worldly advice, and painfully poignant reflections on the passing of life and ever-hovering presence of death. The Changing Light at Sandover is nothing less than a new mythology of world creation, destruction, resurrection, and the vast, unknowable mechanizations of God biology, God be, in the words of the Ouija board, and those mysterious hosts who enact his will, bat-winged creatures who, in their cosmological laboratory, reconstruct departed souls for new life on Earth. And yet we are never far from the grounding human voice of Merrill, joking about the selection of new wallpaper in his Stonington, Connecticut home, or from the moving counsel of voices from the board, urging, in life, stand for something. It is common knowledge and glaringly obvious in the poems, though not taken seriously by his critics, that these three works, and their final compilation, were based on conversations through a Ouija board, wrote John Chambers in his 1997 analysis of Merrill in The Anomalist. Critic Harold Bloom, in a departure from others who avoided the question of the work's source, called the first of the Sandover poems an occult splendor. Indeed, it is not difficult to argue that, in literary terms, The Changing Light at Sandover is a masterpiece, perhaps the masterpiece of occult experimentation. In some respects, the book challenges the cautionary moral of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, as its two protagonists, Merrill and Jackson, successfully pierce the veil of life's inner and cosmic mysteries. But, as with Victor Frankenstein, did the revelation they found also destroy them? Creepyville. Merrill and Jackson acknowledged that their social contacts with friends withered as they became more engrossed in their nightly readings. Their sometime friend and neighbor, Truman Capote, drifted away, branding Stonington as Creepyville. One of their closest friends, novelist Alison Lurie, even suggested that the Ouija-channeled spirit Ephraim sanctioned the couple's pursuit of multiple sex partners outside their domicile, contributing to the 68-year-old Merrill's death in 1995 from heart failure linked to HIV. All of this leaves hanging the question, can Ouija be a tool, psychological or otherwise, for hidden knowledge and ideas? Or is it merely a disastrously distracting toy? An academic survey of Ouija buffs in the 2001 International Journal of Parapsychology found that 1/2 felt a compulsion to use it. An 18-year-old male offered researchers this chilling account. There have been many interesting ones, but the best would be with a spirit named Kyle. He was a 60-something-year-old child molester. I don't remember how he died, but he seems to have some kind of connection to me. Every time I use the Ouija board, Kyle's name comes up. Most of the time, the people playing know nothing about him. Even sometimes I'm not even playing when he comes up. I think I've seen him twice in spirit form, and he once threatened to kill my half-sister. He's a complete psycho. He scares me. Strange things happen the nights we speak to him. He likes to switch lights on, off. More than 2 centuries earlier, the mystic Emanuel Swedenborg, who inspired so many American spiritual visions, would not have been surprised by such accounts. While Swedenborg recorded his own flights to heavenly realms, he often warned that spirit communications should never be attempted casually. In what may have been the first application of the "don't try this at home" disclaimer, the seer cautioned in his 1758 opus, Heaven and Hell, "At the present day to talk with spirits is rarely granted because it is dangerous. Evil spirits are such that they hold man in deadly hatred, and desire nothing so much as to destroy him both soul and body, and this they do in the case of those who have so indulged themselves in fantasies as to have separated from themselves the enjoyment proper to the natural man." Sounding a different but not unrelated note, 20th century authorities in psychic research made the contention that Ouija is a gateway for the gremlins of the unconscious. For years, J.B. Rhine, the veritable dean of psychical research in America, worked with his wife, Louisa, a trained biologist and well-regarded researcher in her own right, to bring scientific rigor to the study of psychical phenomena. Reacting to Ouija's popularity, Louisa wrote in the winter 1970 newsletter of the American Society for Psychical Research, "The very nature of automatic writing and the Ouija board makes them particularly open to misunderstanding. For one thing, because such communications are unconscious, the person does not get the feeling of his own involvement. Instead, it seems to him that some personality outside of himself is responsible. In addition, and possibly because of this, the material is usually cast in a form as if originating from another intelligence." For his part, the poet Merrill took a subtler view of the matter. "If it's still yourself that you're drawing upon," he said, "then that self is much stranger and freer and more far-seeking than the one you thought you knew." And at another point, "If the spirits aren't external, how astonishing the mediums become." In the end, Ouija confounds. This oddly magnetic toy, the one device from the age of spiritualism still used in the 21st century, evokes nostalgic memories of pajama parties for some, and for others nightmares they would sooner forget. It also left an indisputable mark on the work of one of the greatest American poets of the last century. Whether Ouija is a mysterious instrument, a harmless entertainment, or a dangerous doorway lies in the experience of the user. But the words caveat emptor inevitably hang over the history of this strangest of American curios.